The wind carried dust across the parched prairie, lifting it into swirls that clung to Eleanor Whitfield's skirts and hair. She did not bother to brush it away. Dust had become part of her, now settling into the lines of her face, grinding between her teeth, even lacing itself into the folds of her grief. A widow at 34, she lived on the edge of the New Mexico frontier, where the land gave little and demanded much. It had been 6 months since her husband, Thomas, was buried in the hard soil behind the sagging barn. He'd gone quick one fevered night and gone by morning, leaving Eleanor with a single mule, a leaking roof, and a field that had never yielded more than thin corn stalks and a patch of beans. Neighbors had stopped by in the early weeks, leaving a few jars of preserves, a quilt, or polite words she could no longer remember. But homesteads were scattered thin, and soon enough she was left to herself. The larder shelves showed more gaps than goods. A jar of pickled onions, half a bag of flour, and a small crock of lard. She had stretched them carefully, but September's nights were growing colder, and winter promised no mercy. Her hands were already cracked from labor, her back bent from carrying water in the wooden pail since the well rope had frayed. The mule was gaunt, ribs sharp under its hide, and she feared come December she might be too. What Eleanor hated most was the silence. It pressed against her, especially at dusk when shadows reached long and the coyotes began to yip. The silence reminded her of everything gone: her husband's steady baritone as he read from the worn Bible, the occasional laughter of passing ranchers who shared a cup of coffee by the fire. Even the soft crackle of kindling Thomas used to split for her. Now she split it herself, though her axe often lodged crooked in the log, leaving her muttering curses her mother would never have forgiven. She had written to her sister in Kansas, begging to be taken in. The reply came weeks later by post rider, blunt and apologetic. There was no room, not with 5 children underfoot already and crops failing after too much rain. Eleanor was welcome to visit when times improved. She had burned the letter in a fit of bitterness, though later she regretted wasting the paper. Each morning she asked herself the same question: how much longer could she keep on? Pride kept her clinging to the homestead. This had been Thomas's dream, a piece of land to call their own, carved from wilderness. She remembered the shine in his eyes when they first rode out here, how he'd sworn the soil was rich, how he promised fruit trees one day. She had believed him, because to believe was easier than to face the barren truth. Now she watered the trees that never sprouted and tried not to curse him for leaving her with nothing but debts and a gravestone. The town, 20 miles distant, held no salvation. She had been there twice since Thomas's passing, once to trade eggs for a few pennies, and again to inquire about work. The mercantile owner had laughed, kindly enough, but pointed out there was little use for a widow with no children and no dowry. The boarding house already had a cook, and sewing was done by women with kin to support them. A preacher's wife had suggested she remarry. The very thought curdled Eleanor's stomach. She had no heart left for another man, nor the energy to smile and pretend she did. So she scraped by day after dry day. When hunger pinched, she chewed wild chicory root. When loneliness clawed at her chest, she spoke aloud to the mule or hummed a hymn she half remembered. But despair stalked her all the same. Nights grew longer, and when she lay in bed staring at the sagging ceiling, her mind turned over dark thoughts. Perhaps she should sell the mule for meat, abandon the land, walk east until she found something better, or simply lie down and let the world take her. Yet, for all her weariness, some ember of defiance remained. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe just the habit of survival. Each morning, no matter how bleak, she rose, stoked the fire, and set about her chores. She clung to the faint belief that anything might change. It was on. One such morning, with her apron still damp from wringing out laundry and her arms aching from scrubbing, that she saw the riders in the distance, a line of figures on horseback moving slow but steady toward her cabin. Her breath caught. Number. Neighbors lived near enough to call unannounced. She knew at once it must be the Apache. Her first instinct was fear. Stories told in town painted them as raiders, thieves, worse. She reached for the shotgun leaning by the door, though she knew in her gut she hadn't the will to fire it. As the riders drew closer, she saw children among them, 6 girls, their dark braids glinting in the sunlight, their ponies decorated with bright woven blankets. And at their head rode a man tall and grave, his eyes unreadable. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest. Hunger, loneliness, fear all collided in that moment. She did not know yet that this meeting would alter everything. The riders drew up before the cabin, horses snorting in the cool morning air. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her shotgun gripped tight, though she held it low, uncertain whether to aim or hide it altogether. The man at the front dismounted first. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he wished to give her time to see he carried no weapon in his hands. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a leather shirt decorated with beads and fringes. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung loose past his shoulders, streaked here and there with gray. His face was solemn, weathered by sun and years, but his dark eyes were sharp. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm, each word measured, as though he had chosen them carefully in her language. "You are alone here," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the shotgun. She swallowed. "I am." The girls remained mounted behind him, 6 pairs of eyes wide with curiosity. They were of different ages, the eldest perhaps 12, the youngest no more than 4. Each one sat straight and proud, though the little one leaned against her sister, half hidden in her braid. The man inclined his head. "I am Running Hawk, chief of my people." He gestured toward the girls. "These are my daughters." Eleanor's heart beat faster. She had never spoken to an Apache before, only seen them at a distance when traveling near town. The stories told by settlers came rushing back, raids on wagons, fires in the night, scalps taken as trophies. Yet what she saw before her did not match the blood-soaked tailies. These were children. Tired, wary, but children all the same. She forced her voice steady. "What do you want?" Running Hawk's gaze did not waver. "Help." The word hung in the air, strange and unexpected. Eleanor blinked. "Help?" He nodded once. "There. Mother is gone. My duties to my people keep me from them. They need care." His eyes flicked toward the cabin, then back to her. "You are alone. You need food, protection. I ask you to keep them, teach them, feed them. In return, you will not be left wanting." Eleanor nearly laughed, though the sound would have come out brittle. The idea was absurd. 6 children? Apache children? She could barely keep herself alive. Her flour barrel was nearly empty, her mule half starved. And what would the town say if they learned she harbored the chief's daughters under her roof? They'd call her a traitor, a madwoman. But behind her anger and fear flickered something else, a sliver of temptation. Food, protection, safety. Those were things she had not known in months. To be guarded by an Apache chief was to be spared the fear of raids, not burdened by them. And though she would not admit it aloud, the silence in her cabin had been eating her alive. She lifted her chin. "Why me?" Running Hawk studied her for a long moment before replying. "Because you are strong. You remain when others would leave. My people see this. My daughters need a woman who endures." The word struck her like a blow. Strong, enduring. She had not felt either in so long. She had felt broken, hollow, worn thin as old cloth. Yet here was a man an enemy, if she believed the townsfolk telling her she was something more. Still, her mistrust rose like a wall. And if I refuse? His expression did not change. Then I take them elsewhere. But I believe this path was given to me for a reason. He glanced at his daughters again, softer this time. They have lost their mother. I will not lose them also. The smallest girl slid down from her pony then, padding barefoot to Eleanor's doorway. She tilted her head back, eyes wide and solemn. Without a word, she reached out and touched the hem of Eleanor's skirt, as if testing whether she was real. Eleanor froze. The touch was light as a moth's wing, but it pierced deeper than any blade. She looked down at the child's face, so earnest, so trusting, and something in her chest cracked open. Her mouth felt dry. She looked past the girl to Running Hawk. "I'll need food," she said, her voice hoarse, "and blankets. Winter's coming." A spark of relief glimmered in his eyes. He inclined his head once more, the motion dignified. "You shall have what you need." Eleanor exhaled slowly, lowering the shotgun to the floor. She did not know whether she had made the greatest mistake of her life or the only choice that could possibly save it. The first night with the girls was a trial. Eleanor had expected it, but not the shape it took. 6 pairs of curious eyes followed her every movement, as though she were some oddity plucked from another world. Perhaps she was. She had laid down. Rules: no noise after sunset, no wandering from the cabin. But children, it seemed, regarded rules as suggestions. The eldest, Mourning Dove, tried to help. She kept her younger sisters in line with a sharp word or a stern look, but even she could not stop the mischief entirely. The middle girls, singing Brook and Little Fawn, giggled endlessly at Eleanor's attempts to scold them in halting Apache. Words she barely knew. The 2 smallest, Red Feather and Sky Blossom, treated her as if she were a strange ant climbing onto her lap uninvited, touching her hair, tugging at her apron. The second eldest, Willow, said little but stared at her with watchful suspicion, as though testing every word for hidden meaning. Eleanor, unused to any company, felt as though she had been dropped into a river current too swift to stand against. Her cabin, once silent, now rattled with voices, footsteps, and laughter. She longed for quiet even as she dreaded it. Food was her first worry. She had fretted for days about how to feed 6 children on scraps. True to his word, Running Hawk had sent provisions: venison dried and smoked, baskets of cornmeal, beans, squash, even a pouch of herbs Eleanor could not name. It was more food than she had seen in her kitchen since Thomas died, and she nearly wept as she laid it out on the shelves. Still, she guarded it carefully, measuring portions, ensuring the children ate but never wasted. Cooking for them, however, became a battlefield. The girls laughed at her biscuits, poked at the gravy with suspicion, and whispered to each other in rapid Apache. They preferred their own way, roasting strips of meat over the fire, grinding cornmeal into a mash, or mixing herbs that gave the food a tang Eleanor found strange. The first time she tasted it, she wrinkled her nose, which sent the girls into peals of laughter. Mourning Dove, trying to bridge the gap, showed her how to mash the corn properly, her small hands surprisingly deft. Eleanor, stiff with pride, allowed it, though she muttered under her breath about savages teaching her to cook. Night brought another struggle. The cabin was small, only 2 rooms. She had given the girls the main room, spreading blankets on the floor while she kept her small cot behind a curtain. Yet sleep did not come easy. The girls whispered and sang softly in their language, their voices rising and falling like the wind. One began to cry for her mother, and soon 2 others joined. Eleanor sat up, clutching her quilt, unsure what to do. Comfort was not her gift. She had never borne children, never learned the ways of soothing them. Still, she rose awkwardly, patting the youngest's back, murmuring nonsense words until the sobbing eased. When silence finally settled, Eleanor lay awake staring at the beams of the ceiling, She told herself this was madness. 6 children she could barely understand, an Apache chief coming and going as he pleased. What was she doing? She had spent months fearing such people, and now she shared her hearth with them. If word reached town, she would be branded a traitor, an outcast, and yet she remembered the little one's hand on her skirt that morning, remembered the way their laughter had filled the cabin like sunlight through cracked shutters. The fear remained, but it tangled with something else, a reluctant warmth she dared not name. Running Hawk came the next evening, bringing firewood and 2 rabbits strung by their legs. He crouched near the fire, watching the girls chatter around Eleanor. His eyes flicked toward her, unreadable. She bristled at the scrutiny. "They're wild," she muttered, half to herself, as one of the younger girls toppled a tin cup of water. "They are children," he said simply. Eleanor bit back a retort, surprised at the gentleness in his tone. She had expected command, not quiet patience. He rose, leaving the rabbits by the hearth. "They will test you," he said. "As they test me, if you endure, they will honor you." She crossed her arms. "I don't need their honor. Just peace. In my own house." A flicker of something amusement perhaps touched his mouth. "Peace is not given, it is made." With that, he gathered his daughters into a quick embrace, murmured to them in his tongue, and left into the dusk. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching him go, the rabbits heavy in her hands. "Peace," he had said. She wondered what peace meant anymore, and whether it could be found with 6 Apache girls under her roof. By the second week, Eleanor realized she had underestimated just how deeply the presence of 6 girls would change her life. The cabin, once quiet as a tomb, now pulsed with energy from dawn until long after dusk. Nothing was simple anymore. Nothing was hers alone. Her broom wore down to bristles trying to keep up with the constant trail of dust the girls carried in. Their moccasins tracked soil across her plank floor, their hair shed in long black strands that clung to corners, and their laughter echoed so loud she sometimes pressed her hands over her ears just to breathe. The first great battle was over. Chores. Eleanor had assumed that girls, no matter their blood, could be taught to fetch water, mend shirts, and sweep floors. She had underestimated how differently their world had shaped them. Morning Dove obeyed quickly enough, though with a quiet frown, while Willow seemed determined to ignore every instruction, standing back with folded arms. The younger ones darted about like sparrows, turning her orders into a game. They fetched water only to splash it at each other, giggling wildly until Eleanor shouted herself hoarse. One morning she found Singing Brook attempting to hang strips of venison from the rafters. "You'll stain the wood," Eleanor scolded, trying to pull them down. But the girl only grinned, replying in a tumble of words Eleanor barely understood. Morning Dove stepped in to translate. "She says it keeps the meat safe, away from rats." Eleanor paused, surprised. She had never thought of that. For years she'd stored meat in crocks or the cool earth. She muttered that she'd consider it, though she ended up letting the strips stay. Another day, the clash came over fire. Eleanor carefully stacked kindling, just as Thomas had shown her, only to find Willow rearranging it into a teepee shape. Eleanor tried to stop her, but the girl shook her head fiercely, striking flint until sparks caught. The fire roared too, life faster than Eleanor's had ever done. She stood staring, equal parts irritated and impressed. Meals were their own ordeal. Eleanor served biscuits with lard gravy one evening, proud of her effort, but the girls exchanged glances and pushed the food around their tin plates. Then Little Fawn pulled out a pouch of dried herbs, sprinkling them over the biscuits. The smell was sharp, earthy, almost citrus-like. Eleanor wrinkled her nose until she tasted it. The flavor was richer, more alive than anything she'd cooked in months. Still, the back-and-forth wore on her pride. She caught herself snapping, "This is my house, and things will be done my way," only to feel the sting of guilt when the girls fell silent, eyes downcast. They weren't defiant so much as bewildered. She realized then that they saw her as strange as she saw them at night. When the girls whispered among themselves, Eleanor would listen to their voices rise and fall like a song. She could not catch the meaning, but she recognized tones of teasing, of comfort, of lullabies meant to soothe the little ones to sleep. More than once she rolled over and pulled her quilt tight, fighting the ache in her chest. She had no children of her own, though Thomas had wanted them. Miscarriages had stolen that dream before it ever began. Now, to her shame, she envied the girls for having each other. Her greatest challenge came one stormy night. Rain hammered the roof, seeping through the weak shingles. A thunderclap sent Red Feather and Sky Blossom into shrieks of terror. They dove beneath Eleanor's quilt, trembling. At first, she tried to shoo them away, muttering that they should sleep with their sisters. But their small hands clung to her nightdress, their wide eyes pleading. With a sigh, she let them curl beside her. Their warmth, their steady breaths, as they drifted into sleep, softened something long hardened in her heart. She lay awake listening to the storm, realizing she did not feel quite so alone anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor began to adjust. She learned fragments of their language: water, fire, food, sleep. The girls, in turn, picked up her words, mimicking her with bursts of laughter when she grew flustered. They teased her accent, just as she teased their giggles. Slowly, awkwardly, a bridge formed. Still, suspicion lingered like a shadow. At times, Eleanor caught herself staring at them, wondering if she had made a mistake. These were Apache girls. Their father was an Apache chief. What place did they have under her roof? And yet, when Sky Blossom slipped her a handful of wildflowers, or when Morning Dove offered to mend her torn apron, the doubts quieted. Against her will, she was beginning to care. One evening, she sat at the hearth watching them play a game with pebbles. Their laughter rose and fell, bright and unrestrained. She realized with a jolt that her cabin no longer felt like a grave. It was noisy, untidy, exasperating, but it was alive. And though Eleanor would never admit it aloud, she was alive with it. By the third week, something began to shift quietly, almost without Eleanor noticing. The chaos of the girls no longer felt like invasion so much as rhythm, a strange new beat that carried her through each day. It began with language. Eleanor had always thought the Apache tongue sharp and foreign, but as she listened to the girls' chatter, she began to catch patterns. Morning Dove, patient beyond her years, took it upon herself to teach Eleanor simple words: tea for water, shash for bear, she for me. Eleanor repeated them awkwardly, her tongue clumsy, which sent the younger girls into peals of laughter. Yet, they clapped when she got it right, their pride infectious. In turn, the girls absorbed her English, parroting her words with charming mispronunciations. Red Feather once pointed at Eleanor's boots and declared, "Boo-oots!" so loudly that the others collapsed into giggles. Eleanor, flustered, could not help laughing herself. The sound startled her. It had been so long since laughter had come without effort. It wasn't just words that bridged the gulf. Eleanor began to see pieces of herself in them. When Willow muttered under her breath about chores, Eleanor caught the same stubborn streak she'd had as a girl, stomping when her mother asked her to sweep. When Singing Brook hummed while grinding cornmeal, Eleanor remembered how she used to hum hymns to keep her hands steady while quilting. These were not strangers. They were children, and in their mischief and moods, they reflected her own younger self. One afternoon, Eleanor worked in the garden, pulling up the withered remnants of beans. Sky Blossom toddled over, a handful of wildflowers clutched in her fist. She dropped them at Eleanor's feet with a grin, then scampered away. Eleanor stared at the blooms, bright purple against the dull soil, and felt her throat tighten. No one had given her flowers since Thomas's courtship, when he used to pluck daisies for her on Sundays. She tucked the bouquet into a chipped jar on the windowsill. The nights grew colder, and Eleanor worried about keeping them warm. She only had 2 quilts. But the girls, resourceful as ever, showed her how to stitch hides into coverings, softer than she expected. Morning Dove taught her to weave strips of cloth into thick braids that could be knotted into mats for the floor. Eleanor's pride prickled. She had always thought herself skilled with needle and thread, but she could not deny the usefulness of their methods. And when Red Feather curled beside her under one quilt, sharing warmth without asking, Eleanor found she did not mind. For the first time in months, meals became something more than survival. The girls taught her to roast squash until it caramelized sweet, to add sage to beans, to stir cornmeal into thick porridge. Eleanor introduced them to biscuits again, this time with honey she'd bartered months ago. They licked their fingers and demanded more, their laughter filling the cabin. She realized then that food tasted better when shared, even if portions were small. Still, not every moment was tender. There were tempers. Singing Brook once knocked over her wash bucket in defiance, sending soapy water across the floor. Eleanor shouted. The girl shouted back in Apache, and for a moment they stood nose to nose, 2 stubborn wills colliding. But that night Singing Brook shyly left a small carved bird by Eleanor's pillow, her silent apology. Eleanor held it in her palm, the wood warm from the girl's hands, and felt something stir that she dared not name. The turning point came on a clear autumn afternoon. Eleanor sat mending socks while the girls played a pebble game near the fire. Red Feather suddenly looked up and asked something in Apache. The other girls giggled, then Morning Dove translated in halting English. She says, "You are ta auntie." Eleanor blinked. "Auntie?" Morning Dove nodded solemnly. "Yes, auntie." The word hit her harder than she expected. Auntie. Not stranger. Not outsider. Family. Her eyes burned, and she bent over her stitching to hide it. She had never borne children, never expected to be called by such a name. Yet here it was, given freely by a child who had lost her mother. That night, as the girls curled in their blankets, Eleanor sat awake by the fire, the carved bird in her pocket and the word auntie echoing in her ears. For the first time since Thomas's death, the silence inside her heart cracked, and something new, fragile, tentative took root. She was not ready to call it love. Not yet. But she knew this much. She no longer saw the girls as burdens. She saw them as hers to protect. Running Hawk visited often. Not so often that his presence felt oppressive, but enough that Eleanor began to expect the steady rhythm of his arrivals. Sometimes it was every few days, sometimes a week apart, but always at dusk, when the sun burned red across the horizon and shadows stretched long across the prairie. He never came empty-handed. One evening he brought a haunch of venison, another time a bundle of pelts to line the beds, another time baskets of dried berries and nuts. Once he arrived with nothing but firewood stacked across his broad shoulders, which he carried inside and laid by the hearth without a word. Eleanor found herself muttering thanks. Though her pride bristled at being so reliant on him. At first, she assumed his visits were merely to check on the girl's proof he did not fully trust her. She braced for judgment each time he stepped into the cabin, certain he would find fault with her ways. And yet, he never criticized. He simply observed, eyes steady, as if weighing something unspoken. The girls would fling themselves into his arms when he appeared, laughter bubbling as he swung the youngest up onto his shoulder. Eleanor watched the tenderness in him, surprised. She had expected a chief to be stern, commanding. Instead, he knelt to listen to Red Feather's rambling stories, tied Mourning Dove's braids with careful fingers, and once even allowed Singing Brook to smear ash across his cheek in play. The sight unsettled her, not because it was strange, but because it was familiar, an echo of how Thomas had once been with her nieces and nephews back home. Still, she held herself apart. When he spoke to her, she kept her tone clipped. When he asked how the girls fared, she gave blunt answers. They eat, or they sleep, or they're wild, but manageable. She would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply the children had worked their way into her heart. But Running Hawk seemed to see more than she said. One evening, after the girls had scattered to play outside, he lingered by the fire. Eleanor busied herself with mending a torn shirt, refusing to meet his eyes. "They are laughing more," he said. She shrugged. "Children laugh. They did not laugh so after their mother died." His voice was quiet, but heavy with meaning. The words pricked her. She kept her eyes on the needle in her hand, but her throat tightened. "I've done little enough," she muttered. "You give them a home," he replied simply. She glanced up then, startled by the warmth in his tone. His gaze held hers, steady, unreadable, yet not unkind. For a heartbeat, something passed between them, something she quickly smothered by snapping her eyes back to her sewing. The unease of his presence grew in unexpected ways. She noticed his strength when he carried logs with ease. She noticed the calm in his voice when the girls bickered, and quieted at a single word from him. Once, when a storm tore a shutter loose, he repaired it in silence, his hands deft and sure. Eleanor found herself watching, then caught herself and turned away, cheeks hot. She had buried her husband not a year ago. She had no business noticing. Another man, yet her defenses cracked little by little. When Willow came down with fever, Eleanor sat up through the night, wiping the girl's brow with a damp cloth. At dawn, Running Hawk appeared at the door, as if summoned by instinct. He entered without hesitation, knelt by his daughter, and pressed a hand to her forehead. His jaw tightened, but he did not panic. Instead, he looked to Eleanor. "You stayed with her," he said. "I couldn't do otherwise," Eleanor replied. Her voice rough from sleeplessness. Their eyes met again, and this time she did not look away. In his gaze she saw not judgment, but gratitude, deep, unspoken, almost reverent. From then on, his visits carried a different weight. He was not merely a chief overseeing a bargain. He was a father watching the woman who had stepped, however unwillingly, into the space his wife had left behind. Eleanor felt the shift keenly. At night, after the girls slept, she would sit by the fire and replay his words, his glances. She told herself it was foolish, that nothing could come of it. Yet her hands lingered on the carved bird Singing Brook had given her, and her heart beat quicker whenever she thought of Running Hawk's eyes. She did not trust him. Not fully. Not yet. But for the first time in months, she realized she had begun to trust herself again. Autumn deepened. The air grew sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the rustle of dry leaves. Eleanor worked harder than ever, stacking firewood, patching leaks in the roof, and mending clothes worn thin from many little bodies tumbling about the cabin. She did it with a grim determination, telling herself she was preparing for winter, nothing more. Yet in quiet moments, she caught herself smiling at the sight of the girls stringing berries, or humming while they stitched together. Rabbit hides. Running Hawk came more often now. Not every day, but often enough that his presence no longer startled her. His visits always carried purpose food, firewood, medicine. Yet Eleanor began to notice that sometimes, after the practical tasks were done, he lingered. He would sit near the hearth, silent but steady, as the girls played. She told herself he was simply tired, that he had many burdens. But the truth lingered unspoken between them. He stayed because he wanted to. It was on a chill evening, with the fire crackling low, that the moment came. The girls had just drifted off to sleep, their breathing soft and even beneath the quilts. Eleanor sat at the table, darning a sock by lamplight, while Running Hawk crouched by the hearth, his face shadowed by firelight. "You have done more than I asked," he said at last. Eleanor glanced up, wary. "I've only kept them fed and clothed, nothing more than any woman would do." He shook his head. "Now, you have given them back laughter. You have given them a place where their hearts can rest." She felt her throat tighten. Praise was something she had not heard in so long that it unsettled her. She set down the sock, folding her hands to keep them still. "Why are you telling me this?" Running Hawk's eyes held hers, dark and steady. For the first time, she saw something unguarded there, something vulnerable. "Because I must ask more of you." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "More?" He nodded. "I cannot lead my people and raise my daughters alone. They need more than food. They need a woman's hand to guide them, to teach them, to love them. I ask you not to care for them as a bargain, but as family." The word struck her like a hammer blow. For a long moment she could not speak. Her first thought was disbelief, surely. She had misheard. But the earnest weight in his voice told her otherwise. He was not asking for a few more weeks of help. He was asking her to stay, to belong. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "You mean you want me to keep them? To become?" The word caught in her throat. "Yes." He said it simply, without flinching. "Their mother is gone. But you," he paused, his voice softening, "you have become something to them already. They call you Auntie. They look to you when they wake, when they fall, when they laugh. They will not let you go." Eleanor's vision blurred. She turned away, staring at the fire to hide the sudden sting in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I have nothing. No dowry, no kin, no land worth keeping. I'm a widow clinging to scraps." Running Hawk rose then, standing tall, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You have everything that matters," he said. "You endure. You give of yourself even when you think you have nothing left. That is worth more than land, more than gold." His words cut through the defenses she had built around her heart. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to retreat into the safety of solitude. But then she thought of the girls, of sky blossoms flowers on the windowsill, of red feather curling against her during a storm, of mourning dove carefully translating her clumsy words. They had already wound themselves into her life, thread by thread, until she could not imagine the cabin without them. Eleanor pressed her hands to her lap, trembling. "And if I say no?" Running Hawk's expression remained calm, though she thought she saw pain flicker in his eyes. "Then I will not force you. I will take them elsewhere. But they will grieve. And so will you." The truth of it struck her deep. She would grieve. The very thought of the cabin falling silent again, of the laughter gone, the quilts folded, the pebbles left abandoned by the hearth, it hollowed her out. For the first time since Thomas's death, she realized she was no longer merely surviving. She was living again. Through these children, through this unexpected bond, she drew a shaky breath, lifting her eyes to his. The firelight flickered between them, and for once she did not look away. The night after Running Hawk spoke his plea, Eleanor lay awake long after the fire burned low. The girls slept in a tangled heap on the floor, their breathing steady, their small bodies curled beneath quilts stitched from rabbit hides and scraps of cloth. She watched them through the curtain, heart heavy. Thomas's grave was out there, under the leaning cottonwood near the barn. She had promised herself she would stay by that land as long as breath remained in her body. It was his dream, his claim, his final mark upon the world. To abandon it now felt like betrayal. And yet, what had the land given her since his death? Dust, hunger, silence. Loneliness that gnawed at her marrow. Her gaze drifted back to the children. She remembered Sky Blossom's flowers on the sill, singing Brooke's carved bird in her pocket, Willow's fevered brow beneath her hand. She thought of how they called her auntie, a word that had slipped into her heart like sunlight through cracks. Could she send them away now, back into grief? Could she watch them walk out her door and leave her cabin empty once more? By dawn, her mind was no clearer. She rose with aching limbs, stoked the fire, and stirred cornmeal into porridge. The girls trickled awake, rubbing eyes, giggling, jostling one another for space at the table. Their chatter filled the room, a sound that had once grated but now carried a strange comfort. Running Hawk arrived at midday. He entered with his usual quiet dignity, a bundle of dried herbs slung across his shoulder. Eleanor's heart stumbled at the sight of him, though she masked it with brisk words. "The fever's broken," she said, nodding toward Willow, who sat on the floor plaiting her sister's hair. "She's strong enough to eat." Running Hawk's eyes softened. He set down the herbs, then turned to her. "And you?" Eleanor hesitated. The question felt larger than it seemed. Her hands fidgeted at her apron. "I've managed," she said. He studied her in silence, his gaze steady as stone. It was unbearable how he looked at her, not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as something more. Finally, he spoke. "I will not press you, but I will ask you once more plain. Stay, be their family, be ours." The room fell quiet. Even. The girls seemed to sense the weight of his words. Morning Dove stilled her hands, Singing Brook bit her lip, Red Feather clutched Eleanor's skirt. 6 pairs of eyes turned to her, wide and waiting. Eleanor's throat burned. She wanted to speak, to say yes or no, but the words tangled inside her. All she could think of was silence, the silence of her cabin before they came, the silence of Thomas's grave. The silence that had nearly swallowed her whole. Then Sky Blossom clambered onto her lap, pressing her small forehead against Eleanor's chest. "Auntie," she murmured, the word thick with sleep and trust. The last of Eleanor's defenses broke. Tears welled hot and heavy, slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. She wrapped her arms around the child, holding her close, and let the truth spill from her in a whisper. "I can't let them go." Running Hawk inclined his head, solemn as though she had spoken a vow. Yet she saw relief flash across his face, a breath released he had been holding for too long. The girls, sensing victory, erupted in laughter and clapping. Red Feather danced around the room. Willow tried to hide her smile, and Morning Dove gave Eleanor a look that was half gratitude. Half triumph. Eleanor pressed her face into Sky Blossom's hair, inhaling the scent of smoke and earth. For the first time in endless months, she did not feel hollow. She felt whole. Later, when the girls had run outside to chase each other in the autumn light, Running Hawk lingered by the door. He looked at her not as chief to widow, not as man to servant, but as one soul to another. "You have given them life again," he said softly, "and you have given yourself the same." Eleanor did not answer. She only looked out at the children, her children, though not of her blood, and felt the stir of something she had thought buried with Thomas. Hope. The prairie still stretched wide and harsh. Winter still waited with its cold teeth, but she no longer faced it alone. She had 6 daughters, noisy and wild, and a man who had humbled himself to ask for her presence. Survival was no longer her only purpose. She had chosen something greater. For the first time since she laid a stone on her husband's grave, Eleanor Whitfield smiled without effort.